Hello and welcome to the Out of the Lab podcast, where we discuss the operational challenges in cell and gene therapy. Each episode, we sit down with a different voice in the space, from executives and scientists to patients and advocates, to figure out exactly where the industry is breaking down and how to fix it. Today, I'm joined with Betsy, parent and patient advocate. Betsy, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, Nico.
So the first question, Betsy, I'd love to sort of dive in with you is around the other side of treatment. What happens afterwards? This is something we haven't discussed much on the show, and I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I love that question because it even assumes that there isn't afterwards. Like it assumes there's this finish line that we're going to cross over and there's going to be this land of before and after. And our experience was very different than that. So, as a quick backstory, our son had leukemia. He relapsed and we were treated with CAR T therapy. And the CAR T therapy that we had, it was in 2021 and it was available to us on trial. And so when you enter trial medicine, you both experience the participation in the trial, but then a ton of follow-on care. And so suddenly this, when is it over, especially with something like CAR T therapy, which is dosed, it's a single dose. You have it and it's 5 minutes maybe, and then you go home and kind of wait for symptoms, or maybe symptoms don't show up at all, and then that's it. And then you just have a lot of follow-on measuring effectively. And so when is it over becomes this big question that I've noticed a lot of parents, actually, of pediatric CAR T parents or patients are asking. Because in frontline treatment, you're given this like, we'll ring the bell when treatment is over. And in CAR T, especially with clinical trial, you don't have we're going to ring the bell at X date. So for us, we had my son had CAR T in 2021. The actual original product he got was a Kymriah product, and it did not hold. And so he went back and did humanized CAR T in August of 2021, and that was the one that held for only 4 months. And so he at that point they decided, well, we don't really have any data that shows that 4 months is enough persistence for this to be a before and after situation. So we did a boost with another bag of the product of humanized CAR T, and that didn't work. It didn't hold. His B cells came back in full force, but his disease didn't. And so at that point, we had to choose if we were going to pursue additional therapy, because he had not had persistence that would be classified as curative at that point. And so the teams that we were working with really recommended that we go on to bone marrow transplant. And for our family, that didn't feel like a fit for a lot of reasons I can go into or not. But we decided we were going to take a wait and watch approach. And so from January of 2022, we decided we were just going to wait and see what happened. And if the disease came back, we would pursue whatever treatment we needed at that point. And so that kind of started our after experience, because we were still enrolled in a medical trial. And so we were we were checking his bone marrow and his spinal fluid every 3 months for the first couple of years, and then every 6 months. And then finally, a couple of years out, we thought, well, maybe we'll stop surveilling his spinal fluid and bone marrow. The disease had not returned. And so we stopped looking there and we started relying just really on labs. But as most listeners know, labs are kind of a lagging indicator of what can be happening in the bone marrow, unfortunately. And so we entered into this new space that was kind of have we survived this? Are we still in it? Like, it became very unclear where we were in kind of the survival time and space continuum. And I guess we're still on that journey. I mean, he's coming up this year will be his curative dose, they say, is HuCART in 2021. So this August will be 5 years from that curative dose, and his disease hasn't returned. And so they're, the theory is we could start whispering the word cured. And in hindsight, it feels easy to say, like, well, yeah, he was actually cured in August of 2021. We just had to adjust to what that meant inside of keeping an eye on so closely on him. But what we're realizing now is there's so little by way of infrastructure for the medical conditions that these kids are coming out of CAR T cell therapy with, and probably adults as well. Obviously, my focus is on the pediatric side of things. But for example, he had full B cell return by way of the study he was on, they declared him to have full B cell return. So B cells are divided into three, well, maybe more than that. I don't know. The three groups that I know are the IgG, the IgA, and the IgM, different immunoglobulins. And his IgA never returned. So what that leaves you with is basically an immunocompromised kid who has enough IgG to be considered he's above needing supplemental IgG, which you could give him with a product, right? A pharmaceutical product. He's above the threshold for needing that, but he still has IgA that's immeasurable. It measures at 0, and it has for the last 5 years. That has a lot to do with like mucosal lining. So things like a common cold, gut, stomach indigestion, stuff like that are super affected. And when we talk to our care team about it, we're kind of in no man's land because we were treated by a hospital on clinical trial, which is not studying long-term immune suppression in CAR T kids. They might be in the future, there might be a separate study, but that's not the study he's on. Mm-hmm. The study he's on is, does HuCART therapy work for a CNS-only relapse, was his specific indication. So when you ask them about his IgA levels, they kind of defer to no one, or, you know, they kind of offer a like, yeah, that's something that's happening and people are trying to kind of understand that, and that's it. One recommendation is, well, you should talk to your treating hospital. So that's tricky because we left our treating hospital to pursue trial medicine. So there's some, I guess the relationships are a bit, not as, I guess, not fractured, but there is some energy that goes with telling your treating hospital you're going to seek care elsewhere. And our treating hospital treats 7 to 10 kids with CAR T therapy a year. So even with that low of a patient load, their understanding of long-term immune suppression is not present. And it's just been convicting lately, especially as we're moving away from the fight or flight, like, is he going to make it? Are we going to be on the other side of this? To like, oh no, we're on the other side of it and we're still in no man's land. Like, we're still participating in kind of like the last frontier of what clinical trial medicine actually looks like, which is the condition you get on the other, or, you know, you get pushed out of the trial on the other side of it while cured from the disease that you were seeking, kind of leaves you in this like, well, what do we do now with this? Because no one's studying it. And we're kind of like, we're the indicator that will cause study, but there's no one that has studied it. There's not enough data points probably to study at this point.
Wow. Yeah, it's clear that there's like when you're at the sort of frontier, there is not much in terms of guidance as to where you should actually go, or what's happening next.
Yeah, and there's a lot. I mean, while you're signing, you're signing consents, all of this could happen, right? But I'm sure you can imagine when you're signing consents, like your child has active disease in their body that you are not sure they will survive. And there's a lot of fine print you're signing away, right? You're just like, whatever this says is fine, as long as we make it to the other side. Mm-hmm. And you're kind of thinking, surely someone will know what happens on the other side because we've got all these smart people in the room. We're in like the middle of this industry. There's thought leaders here. So when you get to the other side and you're given kind of this like, oh, well, that's a question we all have. It's like, oh, right. Like we are the front side of science. Okay. And it's interesting, like we're so thankful for what CAR T did for our son and for the curative therapy that it was for him. It's not that for every child. There's still a lot to understand, as I'm sure you and your listeners know. Like there is so much that we don't know about why CAR T therapy works for some kids and not for others, or patients in general. Access, equity, like the democratization of care is still a very big point of reflection and something that I actually focus most of my time on. It's only been recently that we've been noticing these long-term side effects that my son's been having that aren't, they don't alter his life in huge ways, but it's interesting when I ask questions about them that there really isn't a care team provided to us to help with it.
Curious. So from your perspective, what would the ideal situation look like moving forward in terms of like a care team for, future families?
Yeah, I think that's actually a question a lot of people are asking. I do advocacy work in this space, and I've noticed that when we first entered into it, the advocacy programs and kind of people working on the patient side of things were all focused on how do we get patients to care? How do we get them to the cell therapy that's available? And now, just in the last handful of months, multiple of these groups that I work with are coming back with, like, hey, we're thinking about having conversations about how do we get patients through care? Or what do we do for patients on the other side of care? And so I think everyone's kind of starting to realize, we shot for the moon and tried to figure out if CAR T therapy could save people. And that was everyone's focus, was just, can this even work? And now we're finding it can work, and it can work pretty consistently. Obviously, we're still working out a lot of the, manufacturing and kind of access problems, which are still very much present, but we know it works. So how do we make sure that when it works, we actually support the people on the backside of that? I think that having a plan for it, I guess, would be my first ask or kind of recommendation, because as I mentioned, we were treated at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. They have some of the brightest minds in the industry. They are leading, they're on the forefront of all of the newest, latest, and greatest. And so I think part of trial design really needs to be building in the follow-on care. Like, if the trial is going to put a child into the world, or a patient into the world with pretty much, if the trial works, it's going to give them a condition, right? B-cell aplasia would be the hopeful condition you walk away from CAR T therapy with. But even for my son, his B cells came back, but not all of them. So the patients you treat are going to walk, or are going to end up in the world with this condition. I think that having a team, a care team or a specialty team that's dedicated to that, has to be a part of the trial design. I don't know if it's, I guess I say that, I'm like, I don't know if it's trial design. I don't know if it's an industry-wide conversation. I'm not sure. Most people want to kind of pursue the glittery, innovative parts of CAR T therapy, and not the, like, what do we do with this child's subclinical IgA long term? But I think, to the same point, like, there's a lot of data that's being missed. I have a child who's 5 years out, who is cured or has no recurrence of disease, and in his trial did not, sorry, let me say that more clearly. The trial that he was on sought 6 months of persistence, which he did not obtain. And so he would be considered failed from his trial. And yet 5 years later, he's no evidence of disease. I think obviously the data would show there is this patient that's still no evidence of disease, but it would say that the therapy wasn't curative for him. So I think that's an interesting nuance, because you're like, that might be true from a data science perspective. And also, we have a child here who's no evidence of disease, but he has subclinical IgA. And so what are we going to do with that? How are we going to kind of protect his quality of life? And I think we're going to see that more and more as more people get CAR T, right? We have more indications for it. We have more people who are moving through the system, which is a gift, and what we've all been striving for the last, 15 years. I think maybe it's just having conversations like this and having people remember there is no finish line to a curative therapy like this, that, similar to chemotherapies, leave you with lifelong conditions that have to be addressed.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Having dedicated care teams and sort of a plan to deal with these conditions is pretty important coming out on the other side.
Yeah, and I think people studying them, like with the IgG level, it's like, oh, well, we can give you Hizentra, or we can give you, a sub-Q IgG supplement, IVIG, which is great, but also doesn't really explain what's happening with your immune system, right? It kind of gives you a solution for the immediate problem, but it doesn't explain, like, well, what's happening with the IgA? Why aren't we seeing return? And is there a way, is there a way to study it? I don't know. I mean, there is a way to study it. There's something out there for us to learn, but we're not really gathering the people or aggregating the data to make that meaningful.
You mentioned democratization and access. Love to hear your perspectives on that. What have you been thinking about in that regards?
Oh, man. This is a tricky one for me. Our son was treated in 2021. And so when he was treated, he relapsed right at the end of 2020. And the care that was offered at our local treating hospital, which was a large facility, we weren't in a rural kind of, remote local hospital. We were in a regional, well-known facility. They did not offer CAR T therapy. The offer available to us was 2 more years of chemo and cranial radiation, which at the time our son had a CNS only relapse. There was no disease in his bone marrow, and it just felt like, he was diagnosed with like the most standard risk. He was responded beautifully to treatment. He flew through 2 years of treatment, doing all of the chemo that we had thought would cure him, to consider going back into another 2 years of chemotherapy for relapse and possible cranial radiation because he had spinal fluid involvement. It just felt like there had to be another way. And so we actually, in the middle of the night, like late night Google search, I found an organization that connects people. It used to be at that point pediatrics, but now they've expanded their mission to be all patients, but connects people who need cell therapy to the cell therapy that's available for them. And I found them and emailed the founder, and he emailed me back and said, oh, you need to talk to Philadelphia. They probably have a trial, whatever. And even then I went back to our care team locally, and they were kind of like, yeah, I don't know if that's, I don't know. I mean, you could, I don't think this isn't probably a good use case for that, which felt tricky because then I had this care team that we just, we'd been in 2 years of relationship with them, given our full trust that they had the best interest of our kid at heart, which I do think they did. And then now we have this new facility halfway across the country that also has our kids' best interest in mind, we think, and they're offering 2 completely different treatment plans. And so in the end, in a hope to avoid toxicity and to limit the cranial radiation that was on the line if we stayed local, we decided to join the medical trial in Philadelphia. And moving through it, again, when you're signing the dotted lines to make sure that your child survives, you're not thinking through much else. The trial cost is covered and lodging is expensed depending on the trial you're on. Different things are reimbursed, but it doesn't account for, we had 3 children altogether. So we were a family of 5. My husband was at that point 2 years into guiding his child through cancer therapy. So he's like used up all of his PTO. We're in a situation where we're doing everything we can to maintain our insurance. So he's staying in Colorado with our other 2 children. We have to hire full-time childcare because I was now going to move to Philadelphia. So we've got a full-time childcare dynamic. And then me and my other son are moved to Philadelphia. So we're basically running 2 households financially, everything that means financially. And then for follow-on childcare, we had, me or my husband and my child who received the CAR T had to travel to Philadelphia 22 times on our dime. Like we had to pay for flights to Philadelphia 22 times. So round trip tickets, right, for 2 people. It wasn't until probably maybe a year or 2 ago where the dust started to settle from the fight or flight of like, are we going to even make it through this? And I started to think through, okay, we made it through, but look at what happened. We spent almost 6 figures on the life we had to establish while that was happening. And it became very convicting very quickly that it was a place of privilege, like socioeconomic privilege, that we were even able to take that route. And when we chose to do CAR T therapy, I still remember, like clear as day, exactly where I was in my house when me and my husband both kind of had that peace that passes understanding moment, for lack of a better metaphor, where we both were like, you know what, we're going to do CAR T. If this can help any other kid, like if giving our child to this process can help any other kid, let's do it. Let's just go all in on this. It will help the data, which will hopefully help it become an indication for earlier relapse. Like at this point in 2021, and actually even still, you often can only get it when you're on your 2nd or 3rd relapse. And so at the time, I thought that meant my commitment was that we were going to give our child to this medical trial. We were going to go all in on getting the data. And then as the dust started to settle, I was like, oh, no, that's not what I'm here for. Like what I'm here for is realizing that The reason we got to this trial was complete inequity inside of the system. Whether we have data or not, which my child has provided, it's a big reason why we were really committed to the follow-up trial, trial follow-up, which is hard. A lot of patients drop out of trial follow-up after a couple of years, and we're very committed to going through year 15, which is how long the trial follow-up lasts. I realize that it's not actually about the data. It's about the fact that, you had a gentleman on your podcast a couple weeks ago, Lee, who talked about 80% of patients who could benefit, who could find cure in CAR T therapy, don't have a path to it. Most parents cannot move their family across the country. Most parents cannot hire a full-time nanny for their children back home. And I think that that's convicting in a way that I'm not really interested in just like, well, thank goodness we could. I'm like, yes, that's a great place to start. And now what? Like, how do we actually make this accessible so that any kid in any state, I guess I would say I joke, but it's not very funny. I say that it shouldn't be a tenacious mom that gets a kid a chance at survival. That shouldn't be the limiting factor. And as of now, it is. And so I guess that's my commitment, is I'm just trying to work to fix that.
Yeah. Wow. So I'd love to sort of unpack that a bit. Clearly it's expensive. Even if the clinical trial costs are directly covered, there's travel, maintaining households. What do you think are the sort of top priorities in terms of what are those things that are preventing access in terms of direct costs for most people?
I think this is where I get into like decentralized apheresis, manufacturing, production happening on site, or even, for us, we were participating in a trial. So the trial specificity is a bit different because they have to manufacture all of the products in the same kind of conditions. So I think it's tricky because our experience was on trial. I'm hopeful now when kids have it more accessible commercially that this wouldn't be the case. Our apheresis was done in 2021, and luckily because of the COVID dynamic and everyone kind of being flexible inside of traveling while immune compromised and that variable, we were able to do decentralized apheresis. And so we were able to go to our local children's hospital 50 minutes from our house, be apheresed there, and then they transported the cells back east to be produced. And so I think while I understand that it clouds the data and that there is, especially in cell and gene therapy, the manufacturing process and the production are areas where things can really go awry. So I think keeping that data as clean as possible is important. I also think figuring out where the levers can be moved are also valuable. Making sure that kind of the open access to what we're learning about manufacturing, I think it's a little bit less, it's not as much of an open marketplace of information and idea sharing. So things like decentralized apheresis, that's why earlier I was saying like we could talk about that, because I think that is important. But ultimately apheresis is one part of it, right? That's a one-day process. We still need to get it to where kids aren't traveling across the country and then being observed for 6 weeks at their treating hospital. Which, it's a lot of economic roadblocks, the machines for the production, the machines for apheresis. And then, I don't know, maybe it's just the slow boat of getting more patients through care. I know that there were some patients that came shortly after us in our trial that said they went to Philly because their treating hospital hadn't treated anyone with CAR T. And while they were willing to do it, you read all of this fine print about the things that can happen, the side effects, the, ICANS and CRS reactions. And you're thinking, well, I don't want to be at a facility that's never handled this before. I'd rather just go to the facility that did the first pediatric trial. So I think part of it is kind of educating everyone on like all boats rise with a rising tide. How do we get everyone up to speed on how to manufacture, administer, deal with the side effects of it, so that it's not only about accessing care, it's about accessing safe care wherever you are, wherever across the country you are.
Yeah. So one thing I'm curious about, so I understand that you had access to the decentralized apheresis, and sort of a next frontier is the actual redelivery, the reinfusion. And I'd love to understand, like, what are all of the parts of the things you had to be in Philly for? So there's like the redelivery. What else in between?
So for us, so we were apheresed in Colorado. They sent that product, and that was only because our local hospital had an apheresis clinic, right? That's pretty uncommon. I think it's the only one in the region. So we were already just gifted with having this regional hospital near us. So we were apheresed. They sent the product, the cells, to back east to be produced. And we then went to Philadelphia. So when you participate in CAR T medicine, you do lymphodepleting chemo at the beginning. So you're there for 4 days. Well, usually it's like days -6 through -2 is when you're doing the 4 days of lymphodepleting chemo to make room for the CAR T. And then a 2-day break, usually over the weekend. And then on day 0 or day 1, you're getting your cells. And then usually, again, this was on trial. So I think a lot of facilities are different. If you're home, you could just go home. I mean, we were in the hospital getting the cells and then we went home 2 hours later. So it's not an inpatient procedure, but you have to be within, a stone's throw from the hospital so that if you have a reaction, you can go back. So that's what's tricky about this, especially is, if you're living in Philadelphia for a trial, you're in a hotel across the street. So it becomes different. But even people who, let's say, have a regional hospital near them, like we do, our regional hospital, or, our local hospital is about an hour, give or take, we still would have to stay closer because of the possibility for reaction.
Mm-hmm.
So you stay within, a stone's throw for the first, let's say, 7 days. And then after that, again, because I think it was mostly because we were on trial, they're wanting to measure your blood every 2 to 3 days because they're going to want to see if the CARs are expanding and what all your different levels are. And so you stay through day 28 so that you can get the first month of labs and then the bone marrow biopsy and spinal lumbar puncture CSF sample. And then after that, you'd go home. So all in, it's about 6 weeks that you're there. And then again, because we were on trial, we were going back every 12 weeks to be monitored with a bone marrow biopsy and a spinal fluid sample, and then labs, obviously. So if you're not on trial, that becomes a bit more relative. They're not looking for quite as much data. They're still checking cell expansion and B cell levels and all of that. But if it's done any hospital can do that. Like those, research labs are definitely have a higher quantity, but it's not to say they can't be done at most institutions. There were a couple of times on treatment. So for the first 2 years, we went every 12 weeks. And then after that, we went every 6 months, I want to say. And then after about 2 years, we also stopped sampling his bone marrow and spinal fluid. And one time in there, we actually canceled our trip because we were in the middle of kind of a family crisis for reasons related to medical trauma of our other children through this whole process. We were kind of in a family crisis around our other son's mental health. And I just told the team at CHOP, like, we cannot fly out right now. We can't leave. This isn't going to work for us. And they were like, okay, well, you can do your labs locally. Which, again, I know there's some trial, like data preservation needs that you want to have them all run at the same lab. But it was also just this moment where I was like, hold on. So if I tell you that our other child is having a mental health crisis because of the trauma of what we've been through, you're willing to let us do the labs locally. But if I don't mention that and I just say, like, are we really going to still keep coming all the way across the country for, quarterly labs? There's a lot of talk about like data preservation, and we have to, we want clear samples that are all run through the same lab effectively. So I don't, it's above my pay grade to understand the science of that, to understand how data integrity works inside of trial medicine. So I kind of just defer to the belief that they know what they're talking about, I guess. But yeah, there's a lot of things that go unspoken, I guess, in the participation part.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, so there's a lot of work going on to democratize the delivery so that people won't have to travel as far. But it sounds like there's a lot more in terms of the testing. And one thing I'm curious about is, like, do you have to be in one of these massive academic centers for that to happen? It sounds like if you ask it and say the right things, you might not. So yeah.
I mean, I think I'm speaking anecdotally from our experience, so don't quote me or quote me and then everyone push back. That's fine too. I think it is still a bit of a matter of who you know at this point in the game, which I think is my biggest qualm with this, which I go back to. It shouldn't take a tenacious mom to get your child access to care. It shouldn't take a regional hospital to get your child access to care. You know, your poverty level, your zip code, none of it should matter when it comes to is there a curative therapy that could treat you? So I do think that is absolutely still prevalent. When we were treated, the indication that our insurance would cover was only if it was our second relapse. So this was our first relapse. They weren't covering that at that point. They said they would cover it for our second relapse. And our medical team was like, well, locally was saying, well, we could kind of make that work because technically we got 2 samples. That could be a first relapse and then a second relapse, and we could make it work. What we would need, since your insurance would maybe cover it, maybe not, is just a deposit. And this was again at the very beginning to do it locally. They said we would just need a private deposit of $1 million. I still cannot believe these were the conversations we were having. And then it becomes like, forget all of it. We'll just move to Philadelphia, right? Forget the trauma, the finances, the career pivots we have to make. Like, we'll just move to Philly. So I know that there are more facilities that are doing it on site. They're still very much like regional headquarters. Like, there are not community hospitals that are doing this, especially not with pediatric indications. I think there's more trials that are available, you know, Seattle, Stanford, Denver, DC, Philly. I mean, it's still a matter of travel. MD Anderson. But there's no one in rural Kansas that's getting CAR T therapy, full stop. Pediatric, to clarify, pediatric. So we still have a long way to go.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's been a super insightful conversation. So I'm so happy to have you on the show today.
Yeah, absolutely.